So thank you for that introduction. That was really an excellent introductory presentation that the students made, and I think it helps set the tone, right, for the presentation that I will make. So just a quick introduction of myself. I'm Vicente. My friends call me Vice, so you can also call me Vice. I'm a lawyer by training. I graduated from UP in Diliman, both my undergrad and law degree, and then I started practicing international law. Um, I think yung engagement ko in climate change has been largely from the perspective of being able to represent developing country governments in that international negotiations. So over the course of almost 15 years, I have had the privilege of representing not only our country as part of the Philippine delegation to the climate negotiations, but also other countries from Latin America and from Africa and from the Arab region. And so I think that is very useful, at least for me, experience, because it helps me better understand what are the real interests and the real concerns that many of our developing countries face and have when we talk about climate change. So let me talk about how climate change is being addressed. You know, how it is being treated at the international level. Um, First, the introductory presentation by the students pointed out the Paris Agreement, right? And that is important. The Paris Agreement is important because it is the latest in a set of 3 international treaties, you know, international agreements. Ito yung mga, these are the agreements um, that countries have entered into at the international level, you know. So the Paris Agreement is the latest one. It was adopted in Paris, as the name says, in 2015, but it is only part of one of 3, right? So the mother treaty, so to speak, is what we call the UNFCCC, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was adopted in 1992, and it's still in effect. It is still being implemented by governments. And then in 1997, we had the Kyoto Protocol, which is a technical name for a treaty, a subsidiary or a daughter, if you will, daughter treaty to the mother treaty, the UNFCCC. So the Kyoto Protocol came in 1997, and then after that, in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, which is also a daughter treaty of the mother treaty, the UNFCCC. So what do they all have in common? What we have in common among all of these treaties is that they all show us a system of obligations by governments where some of the obligations are common. So all of the governments have to do them together. And some are what we call differentiated, naiba, in short. So there are some countries where they have to do more, and there are some countries where they have to do less. And that is based on whether, for example, that country is rich or whether that country is poor. Right. So in the mother treaty, the UNFCCC, you had a set of common responsibilities where all of us are supposed to work together on reducing emissions and providing information to each other and working together on technology. And then what we call a set of differentiated responsibilities where under the mother treaty, the developed countries, you know, like the United States, like those in Europe, like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Canada, essentially were required to reduce their emissions within a certain number of years. So in the mother treaty, the UNFCCC, the developed countries were required to reduce their emissions to what those emissions were back in 1990 by the year 2000. And then under the Kyoto Protocol, they were supposed to reduce those emissions even more below 1990 levels. And by 5% in 2012, and then by 18% below 1990 in 2020 last year. So, and then in the Mother Treaty, there were also obligations on developed countries to provide money and technology to developing countries like the Philippines to help us do better in doing our climate activities and in adapting to the impacts of climate change. So yung ganong klaseng framework was also reflected in the Paris Agreement, and that is because of the I think the negotiations that took place 10 years ago to 5 years ago. Meron tayo under the Paris Agreement a set of common responsibilities where all countries now have to provide climate action plans every 5 years. All the countries are supposed to report on those climate action plans, and there are certain targets that have to be met. But meron pa ring differentiated responsibilities where developed countries are supposed to be more ambitious in terms of what they're supposed to do in reducing emissions. They're also supposed to continue providing money and technology to developing countries. And the level of their reporting is much more intense. Okay, so ganun yung international regime, international treaties that shape climate change responses from governments and other actors all around the world. But that is not the whole story. Kasi the bigger story is that when we look at climate change action, we also have to look at this picture, which is that we are living in a world that is highly unequal. So for example, karamihan ng tao sa mundo live in countries like ours, the Philippines, which are developing countries, poor countries, essentially. So most of the people in the world live in countries like in Asia, so China, India, Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, the Philippines, and then in Africa, and then in South America. But most of the wealth of the world, yung karamihan ng kayamanan sa mundo, in monetary terms, are in developed countries, so in the US and Canada, in Europe, and then dito sa Japan and Australia and New Zealand. So very unequal. And I think that inequality really shapes how countries think about and act on climate change, as you can see in this next issue, next slide. Because when we look at that inequality and then i-layer natin on top of that inequality other things, like for example, yung technology, magkakaroon ba ng mas maraming robots sa mga factories? Magkakaroon ba tayo ulit ng bagong pandemic? Or matapos ba tong pandemic na to? May mga gera, merong difficulties sa ekonomiya, maraming mga forests natin at saka oceans ang nasisira na, at saka dumadami yung populasyon sa buong mundo. All of these things complicate how we are supposed to address climate change. Kaya yung tanong kanina kung can we fight climate change and can we stop climate change, the answer to that is also very complex. Personally, I believe we can, but it will take a huge amount of effort, and somebody pointed this out in the chat box earlier. It will take a huge amount of effort, not only from the present generation, but from the generation of the children that are on this webinar, and their children, and their grandchildren after that. So it's going to take some time for us to be able to effectively fight climate change. And that is also because of these kinds of in a way, yung layering ng challenges natin. For example, etong 4 maps na to, very instructive as far as I'm concerned when I'm looking at the issue. Kasi when we look at kung tingnan natin itong map dito sa upper left, yung map sa upper right, yung map sa lower left, pag makita natin ano yung common sa kanila, makikita natin na yung mas pula na lugar tend to be the ones where the risk of climate vulnerability is highest. So for example, sa Africa, tapos sa atin sa Southeast Asia, tapos sa Latin America. There are also the areas where more people are poor, so sa Asia and Africa. And there are also the areas where many of the governments are not that stable, right? And that's also, I think, a key factor in terms of understanding why it's so difficult to achieve agreement at the international level on what to do about climate change, because many of the governments that we work with, that we deal with, they do understand these links, that development is linked to climate vulnerability, and climate vulnerability is linked to whether or not governments can stay in power, which in turn is linked to whether or not you are able to address the economic needs of your people. And the worry, I think, long term for us is that, especially, for example, a country like the Philippines, where 10% of our population has migrated overseas, the more that we are impacted by climate change, or the more that our country remains poor, the greater the chances that we will find it, or many of our people, many of our compatriots, fellow Filipinos, will find it difficult to stay in the country. And that means that we might see more and more people thinking of migrating overseas. And that is already happening, for example, in South America, they're going to the US, or in Africa, they're going to Europe, or in other parts of Asia, they're going to Australia. So that is the challenge. And I think a big part of the challenge is the fact that we do have to increase our ability to work on climate change. According sa mga scientists, to meet yung sinasabi nila na 1.5 degree target or 2-degree target na nakalagay din sa Paris Agreement, kailangan natin mag-reduce ng emissions globally, buong mundo, by roughly 7.6%. So that's almost like 10% every year. Pero hindi pa yan nagagawa ever. Okay? The fastest we reduced was last year dahil sa pandemic. And that was only something like 3%. There were some countries that were able to reduce their emissions back in the 1990s by somewhere around 30%, 40%, sometimes even 50%. But that was because bumagsak yung kanila economy. Their economies collapsed. And that is not what we want to do, for example, sa Pilipinas. We want our economy to keep on growing, right? Another challenge for us, and this is for the students that are listening in on this call again as well, is that we only have very little time left in which to really do that kind of reduction of emissions and that kind of adaptation to climate change that we need to do. According to, again, to scientists, we have barely, 20 years left, in some ways, maybe not more than 10 years, in order to really reduce emissions to somewhere around 25 billion tons a year. And that's very, very difficult, kasi karamihan sa ating ekonomiya, not only in the Philippines but elsewhere, are still very much dependent on yung tinatawag na fossil fuels, so yung gasolina or diesel, oil, or coal, at natural gas. Ganito yung hirap, just to give us an idea. For example, sa Pilipinas, each one of us living in the Philippines emit on average last year emitted something like 2 metric tons of carbon dioxide per person. Okay, so isang metric ton is 1,000 kilos. Okay, 1,000 kilos, kung yung pamilya ninyo merong sasakyan, ang 1,000 kilos is, or 1 metric ton is parang isang maliit na sasakyan, so parang Kia Pride, or yung maliit na 4-door na hatchback. Ganun kalaki yung 1,000 kilo. So yung Pilipinas, 2 Kia Pride each tayo ini-emit, okay, in the Philippines. Pero yung ibang bansa mas malaki. For example, sa US, 15.5 small cars. So imaginein mo, nakahilera dyan sa EDSA, 15.5 small cars lined up down the road. That's 15.5 metric tons that is emitted by an average American. An average Australian emits more, for example, and Canada emits even much more, something like almost 20 small cars worth ang average Canadian. So maliit yung in-emit per person sa Pilipinas. And that's why I think a big part of that is because of the way yung economy natin gets its energy, and of course the population size of the country. And ito yung, I think, one of those things na why countries find it so difficult kasi currently, because of how we get our energy, how electricity is produced, where we get that energy from, which is still mostly oil, coal, or gas, including for our cars, for the power plants, like for Napocor or Meralco and all that. Halos linked pa rin yung pag-produce ng energy at saka yung pag-produce ng emissions like carbon dioxide at saka yung amount of income that can be generated from that energy use. And the only way that we can break this link is if we introduce new technology, for example, like renewable energy technology. But for countries like the Philippines, some of those technologies might still be expensive, baka hindi pa affordable. So that is sort of like the challenge that we face there. So you ask about ano ba yung COP26 at saka ano yung role natin at ano yung magagawa natin sa COP26. So international negotiations is really about communicating, di ba? So and your teachers know this, and those of you who listening in who are teachers know this, that what you think is much bigger than what you can say, which in turn is much bigger than what you actually say, which is in turn much bigger than what the students might understand. So smaller, big circle, small circle, smaller circle, smallest circle, yung ganun yung negotiation. So ang challenge namin sa negotiations at the international level really is how to make this small circle dito bigger and bigger so that what you say is what people understand. So it's about clarity of communication. Otherwise, marami kayong disagreement. And that's why often it's so difficult to achieve. Ganito yung itsura ng negotiations sa Bonn. Usually pumupunta kami doon every year in the middle of the year, except last year we did not, but maybe next year we might. So meron kang big plenary hall, tapos meron smaller rooms where negotiators sit in. But it was not like that in Glasgow, kasi in Glasgow it was a different forum, and this is what Glasgow looked like. So very grim, very dark, maulan-ulan palagi. Walang social distancing yung mga pila. And ito yung main stage. This is the main stage, and this is sort of like the big plenary hall where we would be sitting. So when we talk as negotiators in the conference, we usually have our flags like this. And so in my case, I was speaking for this group of developing countries, the largest bloc, 134 developing countries, including the Philippines. And so I would be carrying this. We call it our flag, but it's actually sort of like yung nameplate of your country or your group that you are speaking for. So this is what we were trying to do in the conference, and we would be interacting. So, for example, like me, I would be getting advice from the members of my negotiating group, trying to get their ideas so that then I can feed that back to them. So there are instances where in the negotiations we are really pressed because we need to agree on something or to really discuss something. And so the tendency for us is to do what we call huddles. You know, so yung kumbaga magbarkada kayo, and then you work together, you group around, you know, if you were still in school, and to discuss more directly. This is what we tried to do in that conference in Scotland last week. So what did COP26 come out with? I thought I would sort of like just highlight some of the headline statements that came out from COP26, and then sort of like give you a quick assessment of where we are. One, on adaptation. So adaptation is how we make ourselves, make our communities, or make our country better able to withstand the impact of climate change. For example, we launched what we call a work program on the global goal on adaptation. So this is essentially another series over the next 2 years of discussing how do we, what is our target as a global community on adaptation? Is it, for example, reducing the number of lives lost, or reducing the number of communities that would be lost, or is it about additional financing? Then there was a statement that, you know, the rich countries should increase their the amount of adaptation finance that they would give. Then we have what we call loss and damage. This is the issue where we would be working together to help communities and countries, developing countries, to address, to respond to the impacts of climate change that adaptation cannot provide. And so one of the big outcomes there in Santiago, in Glasgow, was really a step forward in creating this network of organizations that would allow developing countries like the Philippines to get access to technology and capacity building and training and some money to help us address, for example, pag merong typhoon na dumadaan, tas nagkaroon ng damage sa mga communities natin, that additional money could then come in, or additional technology could come in to help our government address those. Then on mitigation, so ito yung tinatawag na reducing emission reductions, mas marami yung sinasabi dun sa COP26. So there was, I think, more agreement now na dapat bilisan natin lalo yung pag-reduce ng greenhouse gas emissions. Merong bagong target na sinet, so 45% by 2030, so in 9 years. Tapos meron ding agreement na focus yung pag-phase down ng coal at saka pag-phase out ng fossil fuel subsidies. So yung pag-phase down ng unabated coal, ito yung sinasabi, for example, na baka kailangan na nating pag-isipan na i-shut down yung coal-fired power plants, for example, ng Pilipinas. Of course, the issue there is if we shut down our coal-fired power plants right now, magkakaroon tayo ng mas maraming brownout kasi we don't have a sufficient alternative yet for that. So the challenge here for the Philippines, for example, is really to figure out how to slowly transition away from fossil fuels and slowly increase our reliance on renewables like geothermal or hydro, yung mga dams, or solar, or even do research into developing ocean technology and ocean energy technology. Tapos sa Glasgow, we also agreed that every year, that next year, we would try to increase the targets, and then and then there would be an annual sort of like roundtable to figure out, okay, did you actually increase your target? And that will go on for the next 10 years. So on finance, in COP26, there was recognition na hindi talaga na gawa ng mga rich countries yung kanilang promise na magbigay sila ng $100 billion per year by last year, 2020. And there was a request na dapat yung mga rich countries should fulfill their promise to provide that $100 billion, pero up to 2020. So yun yung issue that was a big issue during the COP, because developing countries, yung poor countries were like ours, we're all saying na you broke your promise, America or Europe, and so you have to live up to that promise. And then there were a lot of technical stuff that we agreed on, such as these, and so I will not bore you with that. So, ano yung role ngayon? Kasi there was another question as well in terms of what is the role of the youth and of educators, right? In terms of addressing climate change. And I think one of the things that we have to really take note of is that education and training and public awareness are core commitments, core principles in both the UNFCCC and in the Paris Agreement. For example, and up on the screen, ito yung some of the provisions in the UNFCCC on the role of education. And in the Paris Agreement, it's the same thing. So, for example, there's an affirmation of the importance of education. That capacity building should facilitate access and should facilitate relevant aspects of education, and that there is also a requirement for governments to cooperate in climate change education as well. So all in all, I think what it is quite interesting when we were negotiating, because a lot of the things that we are looking at in the climate negotiations really are things that would impact people back home in our countries. So just going back to the issue of education, you have in coming out from Paris, and then in Madrid, and then this year in Glasgow, we had an increased focus on what we call action for climate empowerment, and this is sort of where the within the whole international climate process, where the role of educators and students and youth would come in. In the Philippines, the focal point for that is the DENR. And what the ACE or ACE does is to really encourage governments to make sure that education about climate change is part and parcel of the education curriculum. And part of that climate change education not only is about teaching it in schools, but also conducting training, ensuring that people are able to participate, providing access to information and public awareness. And it should not be, I think, simply about the science of climate change or about the politics of climate change, but really about, as I see it, about teaching climate justice. What is fair, right? It's not. It's about also teaching that when we deal with climate change, not all countries are equal, because there are some countries that are richer than others, and that wealth of those countries were developed at the time when they themselves were developing, and they did that by going out and colonizing other countries, like what Spain and America did to the Philippines. And part of their current wealth now was because they did that and came to our country and colonized us. And so that is part of understanding what we call this historical responsibility, which is a key part of teaching climate justice issues to our young people. So the ACE process has had a lot of work since Paris, as you can see from these photos. And I think for the youth, that is as an essential part, and there is a big recognition in the process that the youth will have to play a very big role, because this is their future, and the youth are the future in terms of us being able to address climate change. And so when we look at what came out last week on Saturday in Glasgow, we see some of these paragraphs that were agreed on. For example, that there would be implementation of the ACE work program, and that there would be in the future an annual youth-led climate forum to dialogue between governments and the youth. And I think that is important because, as to end my presentation, children really, as Mandela said, are the future. right? And even Jose Rizal said that the youth is the hope of our future. And for those of us who are in the present generation, and for the students that are listening in, um, the hope of a better world really lies in your hands, and it is in terms of how educators work together with the students and work together with those of us who are trying to do our best to shape both international and national policy to make sure that we teach climate justice, that we teach fairness, that we teach equity as essential elements in terms of how we address climate change for the future, because that is our best hope. So maybe let me end here and I'll take questions. Thank you.